Welcome back. The reading of Pride and Prejudice. I did just look up average lifespan during that time because I did initially think that Jane Austen didn't live very long, but her lifespan in current dog years is like crazy. In 18th century, male life expectancy at birth was 34 years old. Female expectancy of remaining years at age 15 rose from 33 years. Around the 15th, 16th century, this was around 42. 42 years old. For most of the century, it ranged from 35 to 40, but in the 1720s, it dipped as low as 25 years old. So she lived a long time, 41. She had a great life. Jane Austen, living to 41, not being what did my high school coach Gibson, what did he used to say? Don't be a statistic. It's like, if you aren't a part of this statistic, then you're a part of another statistic. Like, it's impossible not to be a statistic. He just was like, don't be a statistic, because he didn't want us to like go drunk driving and die or get a DUI or something. It's very sweet. What was a lifespan of a man in 1776? About 38 years old, compared to now is 78. Okay, I would already be dead. I mean, I'm going to be 40 this year. That's so... What was like, so I was expecting the 1300s. 30 to 33 years. Wow. I mean, people had to marry young and people had to just bust out kids so young. And then they were like old and dying at 33. That's incredible. Again, how have we made it this long? That's incredible. Now I'm wondering, like, what were people in Africa like? Should I go there? Should I not? Africa? Can I just look up Africa real quick before we start reading? I'll put a little thing at the bottom that says when I start reading, I promise. How did people in Africa live in, let's go 1700s. Let's go 1700s. 1700s. Boop, boop, boop. Beep, boop, beep, boop, beep. Try my sharpens. Not much is known. Not much is known there. Not much is known about that. According to Google right now, when the way I wrote it. Right. Okay. Chapter 13. I hope, my dear, said Mr. Bennet to his wife, as they were at breakfast the next morning, that you've ordered a good dinner today, because I have reason to expect an addition to our family party. Oh, Mr. Collins. Again, sorry, the casting for the Keira Knightley movie for Mr. Collins was, what excellent potatoes. What excellent boiled potatoes. If you haven't seen the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice movie, you should go watch it because it's fun. It's funny and it's beautiful. And I now understand why they had such great scenery, because Jane Austen was very descriptive in her scenery and just the landscape. And that was beautiful. And the music was beautiful. And the casting was perfect. Donald Sutherland's face was huge. And Keira Knightley's face was so tiny. And Mr. Darcy's face was huge, and it was just such a good movie. Okay, sorry. Back to reading. Who do you mean, my dear? I know nothing of nobody that is coming, I am sure, unless Charlotte Lucas should happen to call in, and I hope my dinners are good enough for her. I do not believe she often sees such at home. The person of whom I speak is a gentleman and a stranger. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled. A gentleman and a stranger? It is Mr. Bingley, I am sure. I've done this all wrong. Mr. Bingley was talking at first. I hope, my dear, said Mr. Bennet to his wife as they were at breakfast the next morning, that you've ordered a good dinner today, because I have reason to expect an addition to our family party. Who do you mean, my dear? I know of nobody that is coming. I'm sure, unless Charlotte Lucas should happen to call in, and I hope my dinners are good enough for her. I do not believe she often sees such at home. The person of whom I am speaking is a gentleman and a stranger. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled. Gentleman and a stranger? It is Mr. Bingley, I'm sure. Well, I am sure I should be extremely glad to see Mr. Bingley. But good Lord, how unlucky! There's not a bit of fish to be got today. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. I must speak to Mr. Hill this moment. It is not Mr. Bingley, said her husband. It is a person whom I never saw in the whole course of my life. This roused a general astonishment, and he had the pleasure of being eagerly questioned by his wife and 5 daughters at once. Right, if you're not just forthcoming with information, you're going to be asked a lot of questions. After amusing himself some time with their curiosity, he thus explained. Good for him. About a month ago I received this letter, and about a fortnight ago I answered it, for I thought it a case of some delicacy and requiring early attention. It is from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. Oh, my dear, cried his wife, I cannot bear to hear that mentioned. Pray do not talk of that odious man. I do think it is the hardest thing in the world that your estate should be entailed away from your own children, and I am sure, if I had been you, I should have tried long ago to do something or other about it. Like what? That's funny. Jane and Elizabeth tried to explain to her the nature of an entail. I needed that also when I read this. They had often attempted to do it before, but it is a subject on which Mrs. Bennet was beyond the reach of reason. Me too. And she continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of settling an estate away from a family of 5 daughters in favour of a man who nobody cared anything about. It certainly is a most inquisitive affair. Oh, it certainly is a most inquisitive affair, said Mr. Bennet. And nothing can clear Mr. Collins from his guilt of inheriting Longbourn. But if you will listen to his letter, and may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself. No, that I am sure I shall not, and I think it is very impertinent of him to write to you at all, and very hypocritical. I hate such false friends. Why could he not keep on quarrelling with you, and his father did before him? Why could he not keep on quarrelling with you, as his father did before him? Why, indeed, he does seem to have had some filial scruples on that head, as you will hear. Fatherly scruples, I think. And now we're going to read the letter. Hunsford, near Westerham, Kent, 15th October. Dear Sir, this disagreement subsisting between yourself and my late honoured father always gave me such uneasiness, and since I have had the misfortune to lose him, I have frequently wished to heal the breach. But for some time I was kept back by my own doubts, fearing lest it might seem disrespectful to his memory for me to be on good terms with anyone with whom it had always pleased him to be at variance. There, Mrs. Bennet. My mind, however, is now made up on the subject, for having received ordination at Easter, I have been so fortunate as to be distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, widow of Sir Louis de Bourgh, whose bounty and beneficence has preferred me to the valuable rectory of his parish, where it shall be my earnest endeavour to demean myself with grateful respect towards her ladyship, and be ever ready to perform those rites and ceremonies which are instituted by the Church of England. As a clergyman, moreover, I feel it my duty to promote and establish the blessing of peace in all families within the reach of my influence, and on these grounds I flatter myself that my present overtures are highly commendable, and that the circumstance of my being next in the entail of Longbourn estate will be kindly overlooked on your side, and not lead you to reject the offered olive branch. I cannot be otherwise than concerned at being the means of injuring your amiable daughters, and beg leave to apologize for it, as well as assure you of my readiness to make them every possible amends, but of this hereafter. He, says so much. Everybody's kind of, beating around the bush a little bit with, inference, and he's just, over explaining so much. It's funny. If you should have no objection to receive me into your house, I propose myself the satisfaction of waiting on you and your family Monday, November 18th by 4 o'clock, and shall probably trespass on your hospitality till the Saturday night following, which I can do without any inconvenience, as Lady Catherine is far from objecting to my occasional absence on a Sunday, provided that some other clergyman is engaged to do the duty of the day. I remain, dear sir, with respectful compliments to your lady and daughters, and your well-wishers and friends, William Collins. Snight, S-E, apostrophe N-N-I-G-H-T. S-E, just to get wrapped around this, and N-N-I-G-H-T. What is it? A week. Tonight is week. Saturday, tonight following. Okay. What was the other thing that I was like, huh? He's an olive branch and oh yeah, what's a patronage? I know he says it all the time and I feel like I should know. I'm just going to patronage John Catherine DeBent. I'm just going to look it up. Patronage definition. Patron. You're just a patron. Duh. Power control appointments or offices. Right. Privileges. Patronage. Patron. Patronage. Patron. Patron. Stop saying patron. My mind is, however, made up on the subject of having receiving an ordination, so he's an ordained minister. Okay. I've been fortunately distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Okay. I think I get it. Toward the sun we shall be. At 4 o'clock thereover we may expect this peacemaking gentleman, said Mr. Bennet, as he followed up on the letter. He seems to be a most conscientious and polite young man, upon my word, and I doubt not will prove a valuable acquaintance, especially if Lady Catherine should be so indulgent as to let him come to us again. There is some sense in what he says about the girls, however, that if he is disposed to make them any amends, I shall not be the person to discourage him. Though it is difficult, said Jane, to guess in what way he can mean to make us the atonement he thinks our due. The wish is certainly to his credit. Elizabeth was chiefly struck by his extraordinary deference for Lady Catherine, and his kind intention of christening, marrying, and burying his parishioners whenever it were required. He must be an oddity, I think, said she. I cannot make him out. There is something very pompous in his style, and what he can mean by apologizing for being next in the entail we cannot suppose. He would help it if he could. Could he be a sensible man, sir? No, my dear, I think not. I have great hopes of finding him quite the reverse. There is a mixture of civility, and self-importance in this letter, which promises well. I'm impatient to see him. In point of composition, said Mary, the letter does not seem defective. The idea of the olive branch, perhaps, is not wholly new, yet I think it is well expressed. She's such a scholar. To Catherine and Lydia, neither the letter nor its writer were in any degree interesting. It was next to impossible that their cousin should come on a scarlet coat. I don't know what that means. And it was now some weeks since they had received pleasure from the society of a man in any other colour. Colours of coats seem important. As for their mother, Mr. Collins's letter had done away with much of her ill will, and she was preparing to see him with a degree of composure which astonished her husband and daughters. They said, "What's gotten into you? You seem composed." Mr. Collins was punctual to his time, I'm sure he was, and was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet indeed said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins seemed neither in need of encouragement, nor inclined to be silent himself. He was a tall, heavy-looking man of 25. His air was grave and stately, and his manners were very formal. He had not yet been long seated before he complimented Mrs. Bennet on having so fine a family of daughters, said he had heard much of their beauty, but that in this instance fame had fallen short of the truth, and added that he did not doubt her seeing them all in due time disposed of in marriage. This gallantry was not much to the taste of some of his hearers, but Mrs. Bennet, who quarrelled with no compliments, answered most readily, "You are very kind, I am sure, and I wish with all my heart it may prove so, for else they will be destitute enough. Things are settled so oddly." "Sir, you allude perhaps to the entail of this estate." He's like very... You're talking about me inheriting the estate and kicking all your daughters out, right? Yeah. "Ah, sir, I do indeed. It is a grievous affair to my poor girls, you must confess. Not that I mean to find fault with you, for such things I know are all chance in this world. There is no knowing how estates will go when once they come to be entailed. I am very sensible, madame, of the hardships to my fair cousins, and could say much on the subject, but that I am cautious of appearing forward and precipitate. But I can assure the young ladies that I come prepared to admire them. At present I will not say more, but perhaps when we are better acquainted." He was interrupted by the summons to dinner, and the girls smiled on each other. They were not only the subject of Mr. Collins's admiration. The hall, the dining room, and all its fortunes were examined and praised, and his recommendation of everything would have touched Mrs. Bennet's heart, but for the mortifying supposition of his viewing it all as his own future property. This is too crazy. This would be too crazy. Like, imagine if this happened now. If some guy was like, yes, cool lamp. Okay, I'm into that. I think I would change that. I do like this bay window, though, so I'll keep that, but I don't like, if he's like, just, that would be crazy. The dinner, too, in its turn was highly admired. He loves to admire things, and he begged to know which of his fair cousins the excellency of its cooking was owing. What excellent boiled potatoes! But he was set right there by Mrs. Bennet, who assured him with some asperity that they were very able to keep a good cook, and that her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. He begged pardon for having displeased her in a softened tone. She declared herself not at all offended, but he continued to apologize for about a quarter of an hour. He apologized for 15 minutes. I am going to look asperity because aspiration. Oh no, asperity, harshness of tone or manner. What? He was assured it with some asperity. Yes.
Asperity.
Asperity. It's too breathy. Asperity. I'm just going to write it down to make me remember that I didn't know it at one time and to try to remember what it means at this time. End of chapter 13. Now on to chapter 14. We're really pushing through. How many chapters in this book? I'm not going to look ahead and read 50, 60. L plus X is 60. Okay, there are 60 chapters in this book, and we're plugging along, y'all. It's chapter 14. During dinner, Mr. Bennet scarcely spoke at all, thinking about his own death, probably. Golly. But when the servants were withdrawn, he thought in time to have some conversation with his guest, and therefore started a subject in which he expected him to shine, by observing that he seemed very fortunate in his patroness. Lady Catherine de Bourgh's attention to his wishes and consideration for his comfort appeared very remarkable. Mr. Bennet could not have chosen better. Mr. Collins was eloquent in her praise. The subject elevated him more than usual solemnity of manner, And with a most important aspect, he protested that he had never in his life witnessed such behaviour in a person of rank, such affability and condescension as he had himself experienced from Lady Catherine, the Dame Judi Dench. She will always and forever be the best, and I love her so. She had been graciously pleased to approve of both of the discourses which he had already had the honour of preaching before her. She had also asked him twice to dine at Rosings, and had sent for him only the Saturday before to make up her pool of a quadrille in the evening. It's about cards, I think, again. They love to do card games. Lady Catherine was reckoned proud by many people he knew, but he had never seen anything but affability in her. She had always spoken to him as she would to any other gentleman. She made not the smallest objection to his joining in the society of the neighbourhood, nor to his leaving the parish occasionally for a week or two to visit his relations. She had even condescended to advise him to marry as soon as he could, provided he chose with discretion, and had once paid him a visit in his humble parsonage, where she had perfectly approved all the alterations he had been making, and had been even vouchsafed to suggest some herself, some shelves in the closet upstairs. "That is all very proper and civil, I am sure," said Mrs. Bennet, "and I dare say she is a very agreeable woman. It is a pity that great ladies in general are not more like her. Does she live near you, sir? The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rosing Park, her ladyship's residence." "I think you said she was a widow, sir. Has she any family?" "She has only one daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and of very extensive property." "Ah," said Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head, "then she is better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome?" "She is a most charming young lady indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that, in point of true beauty, Miss de Bourgh is far superior than the handsomest of her sex, because there is that in her features which marks the young lady of distinguished birth. She is unfortunately of a sickly constitution, which has prevented her from making that progress in many accomplishments which she could not have otherwise failed of, as I am informed by the lady who superintended her education, and who still resides with them. She is perfectly amiable, and often condescends to ride to my humble abode in her little phaeton and ponies." "Has she been presented? I do not remember her name among the ladies at court." Wow, this is like when people were presented at court as like they are of age. What a crazy time. What a crazy time. Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her from being in town, and by that means, I am told, Lady Catherine one day has deprived the British court of its brightest ornaments. Her ladyship seemed pleased with the idea that you may imagine that I am happy on every occasion to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to the ladies. I have more than once observed to Lady Catherine that her charming daughter seemed born to be a duchess, and that the most elevated rank, instead of giving her consequence, would be adorned by her. These are all the kind of little things which please her ladyship, and it is a sort of attention which I conceive myself peculiarly bound to pay." "You judge very poorly," said Mr. Bennet, "and it is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulses of the moment, or as the result of previous study?" Mr. Bennet. "They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, and though I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such little elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I always wish to give them an unstudied an air as possible." Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped. and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure and countenance, and except in an occasional glance at Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. That's so funny. By tea time, however, the dose had been enough, and Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest into the drawing room again, and when tea was over, glad to invite him to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced, but on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from the circulating library, he started back and, begging pardon, protested that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation, he chose Fordyce's Sermons. Lydia gaped as he opened the volume, and before he had, with very monotonous solemnity, read 3 pages, she interrupted him with, "Do you know, Mamma, that Uncle Phillips talks of turning away Richard? And if he does, Colonel Faustus will hire him. My aunt told me so herself Saturday. I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow to hear more about it, and to ask when Mr. Darcy comes back from town. Oh, Mr. Denny comes back from town." Lydia was bid by her 2 elder sisters to hold her tongue, but Mr. Collins, much offended, laid aside his book and said, "I have often observed how little young ladies are interested by books of a serious stamp. Though written solely for their benefit, it amazes me, I confess, for certainly there can be nothing so advantageous to them as instruction. But I will no longer importune my young cousin." Then, turning to Mr. Bennet, he offered himself as his antagonist at backgammon. Wow, I really want to learn, like, board games and card games. That would be fun. I mean, nobody ever plays games anymore. My friend Becca and I play games, but that's backgammon. Is that one with the board and the die? I don't even know what it looks like. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, observing that he acted very wisely in leaving the girls to their own trifling amusements. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologized most civilly for Lydia's interruption, and promised that it should not occur again if he were to resume his book, but Mr. Collins, after assuring them that he bore his young cousin no ill will, and should never resent her behaviour as any affront, seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet, and prepared for backgammon. Backgammon. I think we had a backgammon board, but I wonder if those were, like, passed down from generation to generation. Like, this was my great-great-great-great-grandmother's backgammon board, and she played with the Lady Catherine de Bourgh, you know. I wonder. 10 plus 5 is 15. Chapter 15. Let's continue on with Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by educational society, the greatest part of his life having been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father. And though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms without forming at it any useful acquaintance. The subjection in which his father had brought him up had given him originally great humility of manner, but it was now a good deal counteracted by the self-conceit of a weak head, living in retirement, and the consequential feelings of early and unexpected prosperity. A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, when the living of Hunsford was vacant, and the respect which he felt for her high rank, and his veneration for her as his patroness, mingling with a very good opinion of himself, of his authority as a clergyman, and his right as a rector, made him altogether a mixture of pride and obsequiousness, self-importance and humility. What a conundrum of a person. Having now a good house and a very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters, if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by common report. This was his plan of amends, of atonement, for inheriting their father's estate, and he thought it an excellent one, full of eligibility and suitableness, and excessive generous and disinterested on his own part. and excessively generous and disinterested on his own part. His plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views and established all his strictest notions of what was due to seniority. And for the first evening she was his settled choice. Jane. He loves Jane. Wow. The next morning, however, made an alteration, for in a quarter of an hour's tete-a-tete with Mrs. Bennet before breakfast, a conversation beginning with his parsonage house, and leading naturally to the avowal of his hopes that a mistress might be found for him at Longbourn, produced from her, amid very complacent smiles and general encouragement, a caution against the very Jane he had fixed on. As to her younger daughters, she could not take upon her to say. She could not positively answer, but she did not know of any prepossession. Her eldest daughter, she must mention, she felt it incumbent on her to hint, was likely very soon to be engaged. Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and it was soon done. Done while Mrs. Bennet was stirring the fire. Elizabeth, equally next to Jane in birth and beauty, succeeded her, of course. They're just tossing around these women like, oh, I can't have that one, I'll have that one. Wow. Mrs. Bennet treasured up the hint, and trusted that she might soon have 2 daughters married, and the man whom she could not bear to speak of the day before was now high in her good graces. As long as they're getting married. This is great. Lydia's intention of walking to Meryton was not forgotten. Every sister except Mary agreed to go with her, and Mr. Collins was to attend them at the request of Mr. Bennet, who was most anxious to get rid of him and have his library to himself, for thither Mr. Collins had followed him after breakfast, and there he would continue, nominally engaged, with one of the largest folios. Folios? I don't know what that means. Go, no, I don't know. No, it's like Australian. What is folios? Folios. A leaf of paper. Numbered on the rectangular front side, occurring either loose as a series of bounds. So you just have like a folio? That's such an interesting word, folio. They're continuing with the largest folios of the collection. But really talking to Mr. Bennet with little cessation of his house and garden at Hunsford. He just can't stop talking. Such doings discomposed Mr. Bennet exceedingly. In his library he had been always sure of the leisure and tranquillity, and though prepared, as he told Elizabeth, to meet with folly and conceit in every other room of the house, he was used to be free from them there. His civility, therefore, was most prompt in inviting Mr. Collins to join his daughters in their walk, and Mr. Collins, being in fact much better fitted for a walker than a reader, was extremely pleased to close his large book and go. He said, please go on a walk with the girls, please go on a walk with the girls. In pompous nothings on his side, and civil assent on that of his cousins, their time passed till they entered Meryton. The attention of the younger ones was then no longer to be gained by him. Their eyes were immediately wandering up in the street in quest of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or a really new muslin in a shop window, could recall them. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man, whom they had never seen before, of most gentlemanly-like appearance, walking with another officer on the other side of the way. The officer was the very Mr. Denny, concerning whose return from London Lydia came to inquire, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air. All wondered who he could be. It's Mr. Wickham. Ooh. And Kitty and Lydia determined, if possible, to find out, led the way across the street under pretence of wanting something in an opposite shop. Fortunately, had just gained the pavement when the 2 young gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. Mr. Denny addressed them directly, and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town, and he was happy to say had accepted a commission in the corps. Did you say corpse or corps? C-O-R-P-S, corpse. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. Right. His appearance was greatly in his favour, and he had all the best part of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and a very pleasing address. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy readiness of conversation, a readiness at the same time perfectly corrected and unassuming, and the whole party was still standing and talking together very agreeably when the sound of horses drew near. Then Notice and Darcy and Bingley were riding down the street. On distinguishing the ladies of the group, the two gentlemen came directly towards them and began the usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman, and Miss Bennet the principal object. He was then, he said, on his way to Longbourn, on purpose to inquire after her. Oh, Mr. Darcy corroborated with a bow, and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger, and Elizabeth, happening to see the countenance of both as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Ooh! Both changed colour. One looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible to imagine. It was impossible not to long to know. Juicy juice between the two. In another minute, Mr. Bingley, but without seeming to have noticed what passed, took leave and rode on with his friend. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillips's house, and then made their bows, in spite of Miss Lydia's pressing entreaties that they should come in, and even in spite of Mrs. Phillips throwing up the parlour window and loudly seconding the invitation. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and the two eldest, from their recent absence, were particularly welcome, and she was eagerly expressing her surprise at their sudden return home, which, as their own carriage had not fetched them, she could have known nothing about, if she had not happened to see Mr. Jones's shop boy in the street, who had told her that they were not to send any more drafts to Netherfield, because Miss Bennet's were come away, when her civility was claimed towards Mr. Collins by James's introduction to him. She received him with her very best politeness, which he returned with as much more, apologizing for his intrusion without any previous acquaintance with her, which he could not help flattering himself, however, might be justified by his relationship to the young ladies who introduced him to her notice. That was a long sentence. Mrs. Phillips was quite awed by such an excess of good breeding. It was just what they said back then. I'm going to get over it. Good breeding. It does something to my body. Mrs. Jones was quite awed by such an excess of good breeding, but her contemplation of one stranger was soon put to an end by exclamations and inquiries about the other, of whom, however, she could only tell her nieces what they already knew, that Mr. Denny had brought him from London, and that he was to have a lieutenant's commission in the shire. This happens a lot, and I don't know what it means, and I meant to look it up. It just says, like, shire, and I don't understand what that means or how I should even say it. I'm just going to say shire. Another Jane Austen quirk that I need to look up that I don't know anything about. She had been watching him the last hours, she said, as he walked up and down the street, and had Mr. Wickham appeared, Kitty and Lydia would certainly have continued the occupation, but unluckily no one passed windows now except a few officers, who, in comparison with the stranger, were become stupid, disagreeable fellows. Some of them were to dine with the Phillipses the next day, and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham and give him an invitation also, if the family from Longbourn would come in the evening. This was agreed to, and Mrs. Phillips protested that they would have a nice, comfortable, noisy game of lottery tickets, and a little bit of hot supper afterwards. The prospect of such delights was very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. They have, like, scratchers. They have, like, little court shillings from the lottery. Lottery tickets. That's funny. The prospects of such delights were very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. Mr. Collins repeated his apologies in quitting the room, and was assured with unwearying civility that they were perfectly needless. As they walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen, but though Jane would have defended either or both, Had they appeared to be in the wrong, she could no more explain such behaviour than her sister. Mr. Collins, on his return, highly gratified Mrs. Bennet by admiring Mrs. Phillips's manners and politeness. He protested that, except Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never seen more elegant women. For she had not only received him with utmost civility, but even pointedly included him in her invitation for the next evening, although utterly unknown to her before. Something he supposed might be attributed to his connection with them, but yet he had never met with so much attention in the whole course of his life. It's like I've never seen more politeness in my whole life. They probably just don't meet a whole lot of people. What an interesting world. What an interesting life. We have continue on next time with chapter XVI, which is indeed 16. See you next time. Happy reading. Bye.